him reelected. And I don't think George Bush could have gotten away with asserting that power. I think that a line would have been drawn.
And yet no major American politician has the courage to stand up on the floor of Congress, as Robert Kennedy did during the Vietnam War in 1968, breaking from his own party and his own president, and in a beautiful speech condemn the bombing, indiscriminate bombing in Vietnam, and use words like, what gave America the right to play God, to rain death from above on a civilian population? And that's precisely, of course, what's going on right now in countries all around the world that, as you say, are far removed from any battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that happens, and you know, it's interesting because as somebody who's worked on civil liberties for a long time, first as a lawyer, now as a writer, one of the things that typically is done, that the primary tactic that power factions use to erode rights, is that they will single out certain individuals who are so marginalized and hated in order to abridge the rights of that individual, with the expectation that nobody will really care because they're so hated. And yet what happens in every single case, the reason why you have to go and defend it when it's done in that instance, is because once that happens, it becomes normalized. It becomes entrenched. The power becomes accepted and legitimized, and then gets expanded to less and less compelling cases. It always expands powers once they're asserted like that. And what's interesting is, you know, when in researching for the book, I wanted to figure out, for example, what was the sort of origins of this idea that elites should be held immune under the rule of law when they get caught committing crimes, even the most egregious crimes. And what I found was that the first instance was where this was really explicitly promulgated was the Ford pardon of Richard Nixon. That was when Ford went on television, and he was very uncomfortable having to justify this because he knew it was shameful and wrong. And what he said was, he went on TV and he said, look, I believe very firmly in the rule of law. The rule of law is no respecter of persons, which is the kind of crux of what the rule of law means. And then he added this concocted amendment designed to gut that principle that he had just invoked. And he said, but the law is a respecter of reality, meaning that if things are too disruptive, if there's too much distraction, if there's too much turbulence from prosecuting elites, then we hold them, then we vest them with immunity. And lots of people, you know, well-intentioned people who are generally sympathetic to the things that we're talking about, actually thought that the Ford pardon of Nixon was a good thing to do because it was necessary for the country to move on. The problem is that once you accept that, it becomes normalized. And that's what we've seen is, subsequent to that, that same rationale being invoked over and over. That's why things like the lawless assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki, even if you are convinced, even though you've never seen any evidence of it and the government hasn't shown any evidence, even if somehow mystically you believe that al-Awlaki really is involved in actual operational planning of terrorist plotting, you should still vehemently oppose the power of the government to assassinate your fellow citizens without due process, because inevitably that will expand and it will grow, and maybe there'll be a leader, and there will be a leader whom you don't trust quite as much as Barack Obama, and if you stand and cheer when al-Awlaki is murdered or other lawless acts happen because you like the result, then you'll essentially be responsible for those subsequent applications that you find less palatable.
The rule of law, not of men, once
right.
again. Let's talk about, you have a great expression in the book that you use, too big to jail, which describes how this elite class in America has become virtually immune from all prosecution. That started, of course, in the official halls of power, but now that's seeped out into the private sector and into even private life. There's an amazing case that you referred to, Glenn, that happened last year in Colorado, where a hedge fund manager named Martin Erzinger, who worked for Morgan Stanley, was driving his Mercedes-Benz at apparently reckless speed, ran down a bicyclist, nearly killed him, severely injured him, and yet and then he sped away from the crime. It was a hit-and-run crime, and yet the Colorado DA...
He sped away and he thought about how he could get his car fixed, but he never called an ambulance to go and tend to the person whom he had just basically...
Exactly. So your basic hit-and-run.
Right.
Does the Colorado DA charge him with a felony as it would with any other citizen? No. The DA issued a statement saying felony convictions have some pretty serious job implications for someone in Mr. Erzinger's profession. Even after David Sirota, who is a columnist for Salon, caused a stir by focusing on the case, the DA still refused to back down. I mean, this is amazing. And we see these cases again and again. while at the same time, the sort of draconian jaws of justice are gripping ever tighter on people who can't afford good lawyers. And you have some amazing examples of cases like that as well. So we're now seeing this spread throughout society.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is really the crux of the problem, which is this. I mean, we've been talking about the shield of immunity, the law-breaking license that political and financial elites have vested themselves. And if this leniency, this extreme leniency, were applied across the board so that everybody on equal terms were entitled to invoke it and receive its protections, I mean, there are countries, for example, that believe in leniency as a criminal justice approach, and people who commit even serious crimes end up serving far less of their sentence than is imposed on them. The conditions of their incarceration are designed to rehabilitate rather than punish. You could have a debate, if it were applied equally, about whether that was an advisable thing to do. So, for example, let's say that you go in, you rob a bank, you go into a bank and you point a gun at the teller and you get $50,000 and you leave. And then 3 months later, the police show up at your door and they say, you know, we have an arrest warrant because we have evidence and have concluded that you were responsible for that bank robbery. If you were able to say, any of you were able to say to the officer, okay, look, officer, you caught me, I did it, I did do this bank robbery, but you know, really, I mean, this is in the past. Do we really want to spend our time digging through the past and figuring out who should be blamed? Isn't
play the blame game here.
Yeah, play the blame game. Isn't that kind of divisive? Isn't it much more important that we look to the future and figure out how to avoid these things in the past? If you were able to invoke that rationale and get away with it, then I wouldn't actually have a problem with on a rule of law ground, because then the leniency would be applied equally. Of course, that's not the case. I'm sure none of you need me to advise you that if you do commit a crime and you get caught by the police, not to use that line, because it's not available to any of you, unless you're a Goldman Sachs CEO, and I don't see Lloyd Blankfein here, or a high-level political official. That's the issue. Because what's so fascinating is that at the very same time, over the past 3 decades, that we've created this framework of elite immunity, we have imposed the harshest criminal justice system that the Western world knows. We imprison more of our fellow citizens than any other country on the planet by far, including countries like China and India, with many more times the number of people that we have. The most amazing statistic in that regard is that the United States has roughly 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of the prison population worldwide is on American soil. We imprison more of our citizens for longer periods of time with less mercy and less forgiveness for infractions that are far too trivial to be considered worthy of punishment in most Western countries. So elites have a completely different universe and are headed in a completely different direction when it comes to American justice than ordinary Americans. And of course, we have this whole new category of war on terror defendants, people accused of being terrorists who get no rights of any kind. They get imprisoned or killed without even the pretense of due process. And to me, the most, sort of glaring personification of this two-tier justice system, this multi-tier justice system, is that if you look at how Richard Nixon rejuvenated his career in the 1960s after he famously lost the 1962 gubernatorial race in California, he essentially reinvented himself as the harsh law and order candidate. He ran against the disorder and disruptions of the 1960s. He criticized Martin Luther King for teaching American youth that you were free to disobey the law if you thought there was just cause. He demanded that we stop trying to figure out the root causes of criminals and start punishing them harshly and without forgiveness to deter them and keep society safe. He basically created the drug war through the invention of the DEA. He was essentially the pioneer of this harsh and absolute unforgiving criminal justice system. And yet the minute that he got caught committing a crime, he was completely shielded. He never saw the inside of a prison or even a courtroom. And it's this extraordinarily disparate treatment where the very elite class that has vested itself with immunity has imposed on everybody else the harshest criminal justice system that the Western world knows, and one of the most merciless that the entire planet knows, this sprawling penal state. It's really that constitutes this radical evisceration of the rule of law.
And it's this growing sense And it's this growing sense that average Americans feel of this glaring inequity, now particularly as it applies to the financial sector and the crimes, the massive crimes that have occurred there, that really is spurring these protests in the streets right now, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting because one of the steps I left out in the media campaign to demonize the protesters, the wildly unsuccessful campaign thus far to marginalize and demonize them, was this idea that, oh, these protesters are really nothing more than just the standard socialists and communists who are kind of
anarchists.
Yeah, eager to rejuvenate that 60s hippie movement.
And have sex, too. They want to have sex there, too.
Yeah, they want to have sex.
Like,
and the New York Post said yesterday that they're seeking out free clinics to see if they've contracted sexually transmitted diseases. So, the idea here is that these are people basically this is what we've been hearing, that they're basically people who just hate income inequality because they're lazy and they're losers in life and they're angry that people have more and they think that the people who have more should give some of that to them because they're just lazy and looking for a handout. It's the same kind of demonization of the poor and blaming of the poor that we've heard since Ronald Reagan, and using, sort of the welfare queen driving around in her Cadillac as a way of saying that the real victims in society are the plutocrats and the oligarchs, because these poor people are too shiftless and lazy to want to work, and that they're just demanding something for nothing. And what I think is clearly true is that you could never have a sustained protest movement in the United States of the kind that we're seeing now simply in protest of inequality in and of itself. And the reason is that, for better or for worse, we as Americans have been inculcated to believe what the founders basically believe, which is that income inequality and wealth inequality are not just inevitable but desirable, that it's essentially a byproduct of meritocracy. So, for example, when Steve Jobs dies and has $8 billion, very few people begrudge that, even though there's mass joblessness and homelessness and foreclosures and the disappearance of the middle class, because there's a sense, again, for right or wrong, better or worse, there's a sense, a belief that outcome is legitimate because he worked hard and invented technologies that improved lives for people and deserved it. So Americans tolerate and even cheer for severe income inequality and wealth inequality if they believe it's legitimate. I don't believe that perception, that opposition merely to income inequality would have sustained and launched and caused to grow this protest movement. I think instead what it's grounded in is this belief, finally, that these outcome inequalities are not fair and just. They're not meritocratic. What they are the byproduct of cheating, of those people not living by the same set of rules as everybody else, using their superior wealth to co-opt the political and legal institutions that were supposed to keep the playing field fair. And as a result, those outcome inequalities are unjustifiable, they're illegitimate. And it's the illegitimacy that I think is spawning the protest as much as anything else.
And the sense that none of their leaders, not even the Democratic Party, will speak up for them. I mean, my favorite example of a traitor to our cause lately is New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who refuses to extend the millionaire's tax in that state, and has the gall to use this as an example, like his father, his stand on abortion, as as brave principle somehow, that he's siding with the multimillionaires on this one. So the representatives in public service who are willing to stand with the Occupy people, the protesters, are very few and far between, it seems, at this point.
Well, absolutely. One of the things that actually made me laugh, like purely laugh, rarely do political events make me laugh to the exclusion of all other reactions. Sometimes that's one of the many things. But this really made me laugh was there was a New York Times article describing how the Democratic Party and the Obama re-election campaign and its organs like the Center for American Progress have a plan underway to basically co-opt the protest movement and turn it into the mechanism, the vehicle for re-injecting the Obama campaign with the enthusiasm that it so obviously lacks. Basically to turn it into nothing more than the Democratic version of the Tea Party. And the reason why I found that so hilarious was because you have to be so completely out of touch to think that's possible, out of touch with the grievances of the people who are protesting, what motivates them and drives them. If those people believed that their salvation, their political salvation, was possible through electing Democratic office holders and re-empowering Democratic politicians, they would have already been out canvassing for Obama instead of marching in the streets. The reason